Silent is the mind that listens, and deep is the heart that knows. Buddha. Dear friends, today we embark on a journey that might just change how you view the universe, your life, and even your suffering. Imagine, for a moment, standing before the most enlightened being in the world, a being whose wisdom surpasses that of the greatest minds of any time or place. And yet, when asked the most profound questions, he remained silent. The Buddha, in his wisdom, chose silence over words in the face of questions that have echoed through centuries and still puzzle the greatest philosophers, scientists, and seekers of truth. Now, I ask you, have you ever found yourself lost in thoughts, wandering through the vast cosmos of questions that seem too great for your mind to comprehend? Questions like, what is the meaning of life? Where did we come from? What happens when we die? These are not just fleeting thoughts but profound, deep inquiries that shape our existence. And just like those ancient seekers who sat before Buddha, many of us search for answers in the stillness of our nights. We scroll through endless threads, watch countless videos, and dive into the ocean of information, hoping for something, anything, that can offer us clarity. Yet, despite our best efforts, the answers often elude us. Buddha's silence in the face of these deep questions wasn't a sign of ignorance or avoidance. No, it was an invitation to look deeper, to question our very approach to understanding. What if the answers we seek aren't found in the words themselves, but in the quiet spaces between them? What if true wisdom lies not in knowing the answer but in learning to live with the mystery? Today, we will explore the 14 questions Buddha refused to answer. Questions that are as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. We'll ask ourselves, why did the Buddha remain silent? What wisdom lies in his silence? And, most importantly, what can we learn about ourselves and our approach to life's greatest mysteries? But before we dive into these questions, let's first reflect on our own lives. Take a moment, close your eyes, and consider the questions that occupy your mind, the ones that keep you awake at night, the ones you return to over and over again. Are they questions about the universe, about yourself, about others? What do these questions reveal about your own journey? Let us now begin our exploration of the timeless wisdom of the Buddha. Starting with a question that has troubled humankind since the dawn of time. Is the universe eternal? When we look up at the night sky, what do we see? Stars, galaxies, and the infinite expanse of space stretching beyond our comprehension. We marvel at its beauty, its vastness, and perhaps even feel a bit small in comparison. But with every look, there comes a question that has haunted philosophers, scientists, and seekers for millennia. Is the universe eternal? Did it have a beginning? Or has it always existed, unchanged? It's a question that demands an answer. We, as humans, crave certainty. We want to know where we come from, why we're here, and what lies beyond. But when the Buddha was asked this very question, he didn't provide a direct answer. He remained silent. Now, this silence may seem frustrating at first. After all, we live in a time where we can explore the farthest reaches of space with telescopes and probe the deepest parts of our own minds with advanced technology. Science is constantly pushing the boundaries of our knowledge, uncovering new truths about the cosmos, the very fabric of reality. And yet, when faced with the question of the universe's origin, the Buddha chose to remain silent. Why did he do this? Perhaps, Buddha understood something that we often overlook: the pursuit of answers to these cosmic questions, while fascinating, may not necessarily lead us to the wisdom we seek. You see, these questions are not just about knowledge, they are about attachment. When we become obsessed with knowing the answers, we lose sight of the present moment. We become trapped in a cycle of endless speculation, and instead of finding peace, we find more confusion. Buddha's silence isn't about denying the importance of questions, but rather, it's a lesson in letting go of the need for certainty. By refusing to answer the question about the universe's eternity, Buddha was inviting his followers to reflect on their own lives. Instead of searching endlessly for answers that may never come, he encouraged them to focus on the here and now, to live in the present moment, with mindfulness and awareness. But this question still lingers, doesn't it? What if I told you that the answer to this question doesn't lie in the stars or the vastness of space, but rather in how we live our daily lives? Think about it for a moment. Does knowing the answer to the universe's origin really change the way you live? Does it ease your suffering, bring you peace, or provide you with a sense of fulfillment? Most likely, the answer is no. It is in the way we engage with the present, the way we cultivate inner peace and understanding, that the true wisdom lies. The universe, in all its mystery, is not here to give us answers, it is here to teach us how to live. So, while science continues its search for the origins of the cosmos, let us take a step back and ask ourselves, what can we learn from the present moment? What can we learn from the silence that surrounds us? Let us now move forward, as we explore another profound question that Buddha was asked, a question not just about the universe, but about the very nature of our existence. Have you ever wondered, who am I? That simple question has echoed through human history, and it is one that each of us, at some point, must confront. What is this self that we identify with? Is it our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, or is it something deeper, something more fundamental? The Buddha was once asked this very question, what is the self? Yet, when confronted with such an inquiry, the Buddha remained silent once again. This silence, though, was not an evasion. It wasn't a refusal to engage with the question, rather, it was an invitation to look beyond the surface of our everyday experience, to examine the illusion of the self that we hold so tightly to. You see, we often think of ourselves as solid, unchanging entities, individuals with distinct personalities, histories, and desires. This is the ego, the self-concept that we carry around. We cling to it, nurture it, and protect it. But what if that self is not as permanent or fixed as we think? In Buddhist teachings, the concept of anatta, or non-self, challenges the very notion of a permanent, unchanging self. According to this doctrine, what we consider to be the self is simply a collection of ever-changing physical and mental processes. Our body, our mind, our feelings, our thoughts, all of these are in constant flux. The person we think we are today is not the same person we were yesterday, and we will not be the same tomorrow. This is the nature of existence, impermanence. When we ask, what is the self? The Buddha's silence points us to the realization that this question itself may be flawed. The search for a fixed, permanent self is a futile endeavor. The more we cling to this idea, the more we suffer, because we are chasing something that doesn't truly exist. This understanding can be deeply liberating. When we let go of the attachment to the self, we begin to see ourselves not as separate entities, but as part of the interconnected web of life. We become free from the rigid boundaries that define who we are, and we open ourselves to the vastness of experience. In modern times, we are surrounded by a culture that constantly tells us who we should be. Social media bombards us with images of idealized versions of the self, leading many to question their own identity. Who am I really? Am I the version of myself that others see? Or am I the person I believe myself to be in private moments of reflection? The Buddha's silence offers us a profound lesson. Rather than searching for a permanent identity, we must embrace the fluid, ever-changing nature of who we are. Think of a river. Its water is never the same from one moment to the next, yet it remains a river. Similarly, we are constantly changing, evolving, and flowing through life. The more we try to grasp onto a fixed self, the more we resist the natural course of our existence, and in doing so, we cause ourselves unnecessary suffering. By releasing our attachment to a permanent self, we begin to open ourselves to a deeper sense of freedom and peace. Instead of fighting against the flow of life, we learn to move with it, to adapt, and to embrace the present moment fully. So, the next time you wonder, who am I? Remember that the answer is not found in a fixed, solid identity. It is found in the awareness of your ever-changing, interconnected nature, and in that awareness, you will find freedom from the illusions of the mind. Now, let us move forward and explore yet another question that Buddha was asked, one that takes us to the heart of human suffering itself. Life is suffering. It's one of the first teachings the Buddha shared with the world. And yet, it's a statement that many of us find difficult to truly understand. Why is it that, no matter how much we try to avoid pain, it seems to follow us? Why does suffering seem to be an inevitable part of the human experience? This question was asked directly to the Buddha. Why do we suffer? And once again, he did not give a direct, straightforward answer. Instead, he spoke of the nature of suffering, of its causes, its cessation, and the path to transcend it. But let us pause here for a moment and reflect on what suffering truly is. We might think of suffering as physical pain, the ache of a broken leg, the sharp sting of a headache. These are clear and tangible forms of suffering. But the Buddha's teachings point to something far more profound. He spoke not just of physical suffering, but of mental and emotional suffering, the sorrow of unfulfilled desires, the anguish of attachment, the anxiety of uncertainty. The Buddha identified the root cause of all suffering in what he called dukkha, a word that encompasses not just pain, but also a deep sense of dissatisfaction, imperfection, and instability. Our lives, as we experience them, are filled with moments of dukkha, no matter how much we try to hold on to happiness or success. It is never permanent. We long for things that are fleeting, and when they are lost or changed, we feel the sting of grief. But the Buddha didn't just leave us with a grim diagnosis. He offered a solution, a path to liberation from suffering. This path is known as the Noble Eightfold Path, a framework that guides us to live a life that reduces suffering and leads to peace. At the core of this teaching is the understanding that much of our suffering arises from craving, from clinging, and from our desire to control the uncontrollable. We crave for things to stay the same, for relationships to never change, for happiness to remain forever. But, as we know, life does not work this way. Everything is impermanent, always changing, and when we hold on to things with attachment, we set ourselves up for disappointment. To understand why we suffer, we must first understand the nature of our desires. The Buddha taught that craving, whether for material possessions, fame, or even relationships, creates suffering because these things are not permanent. We are constantly striving for what we do not have, and when we get it, we fear losing it. This constant cycle of wanting and fearing creates an inner tension, an emotional unrest that is the source of much of our pain. But there's good news. By recognizing the impermanent nature of everything, we can begin to loosen our attachment to these desires. Through mindfulness and awareness, we can learn to observe our cravings without becoming consumed by them. We can begin to see them for what they are: fleeting, temporary, and ultimately unsatisfying. The Buddha's teachings remind us that the key to ending suffering is not through avoiding pain or seeking permanent pleasure, but through accepting the impermanence of life. When we accept that everything is in a constant state of flux, we no longer cling so desperately to outcomes. We begin to cultivate a sense of equanimity, an inner calm that remains undisturbed, regardless of the circumstances we face. So, why do we suffer? The answer lies in our attachments, the things we crave, the expectations we place on life, and the belief that we can control the uncontrollable. But when we release those attachments and embrace the impermanence of all things, we begin to dissolve the cycle of suffering and find peace in the present moment. As we continue our journey, we will explore the question of what happens after death, another of the Buddha's silences that holds deep wisdom for us all. But for now, let us reflect on how we might begin to free ourselves from the cycle of suffering, by accepting the natural flow of life and letting go of our attachments. Who am I? This is one of the most profound questions a person can ask. We spend our lives trying to define ourselves, shaping our identity through our experiences, desires, and beliefs. Yet, when we look deeper, the Buddha's teachings suggest that the concept of self is ultimately an illusion. The Buddha famously said, "There is no permanent self." This statement can be unsettling for many of us. We might think, if there is no self, then who are we? What makes us who we are? To understand the Buddha's teachings on the self, we must first explore what it means to have an identity, and why the Buddha would say that this identity is not as real as we think it is. In our everyday experience, we tend to think of ourselves as solid, unchanging beings. We have names, histories, and roles in life that we identify with. I am a teacher. I am a mother. I am a writer. These roles and labels are part of our sense of self. But the Buddha taught that this self we hold onto is not permanent. It is simply a collection of ever-changing elements that we mistake for something constant. In Buddhist philosophy, the concept of self is deeply connected to the notion of anatta, which translates to not self or non-self. According to the Buddha, what we call the self is merely a bundle of fleeting physical and mental phenomena: our body, our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, all of which are constantly changing. The Buddha's insight into the nature of the self invites us to look beyond the surface and consider the fluidity of our existence. Our thoughts, feelings, and even our bodies are in a continuous state of flux. What we experience as I or me is just a passing combination of elements, temporarily brought together by cause and effect. In other words, the self is not a fixed entity, but a process, a stream of consciousness flowing through life. This teaching can be deeply liberating. If we begin to see that the self is not permanent, we can loosen our grip on it. The suffering that arises from attachment to a fixed identity is born out of the belief that I am this person, this role, this set of characteristics. But when we let go of the need to define ourselves, we are free to embrace the ever-changing nature of our being. The belief in a permanent, unchanging self is also the root of many of our struggles. We fear change, we cling to the past, and we worry about losing the things that define us. But in reality, the more we hold on to these illusions of self, the more we suffer. The Buddha's teaching of anatta encourages us to let go of these attachments and experience life with an open, fluid sense of being. When we begin to understand that we are not a fixed self, but rather a dynamic process, we are freed from the burdens of self-judgment, comparison, and competition. We no longer feel the need to constantly prove ourselves, to chase after achievements or possessions that reinforce our identity. Instead, we can embrace the present moment and the fluid, interconnected nature of all things. In meditation, we practice observing the mind and body without identifying with them. We watch thoughts arise and pass away, just as we witness sensations in the body. Over time, we come to understand that these are not me or mine, but simply phenomena that arise due to causes and conditions. The liberation that comes from understanding the nature of the self is not about losing our individuality. Rather, it is about seeing that our true nature is not limited to the narrow definitions we impose upon ourselves. We are part of a larger, interconnected web of life, and in recognizing this, we can experience a deeper sense of freedom and peace. As we continue on our journey of understanding, we will next explore the concept of karma, how our actions shape our lives and the world around us. But for now, let us reflect on the truth of non-self, and how releasing our attachment to a fixed identity can lead to a life of greater peace and liberation. Death, an inevitable part of life that we all must face. Yet one of the most elusive mysteries we grapple with, what happens after death, is a question that has echoed through the minds of countless people throughout history. We often seek answers, driven by fear, curiosity, or the hope for continuity beyond this life. Yet, when the Buddha was asked about life after death, he remained silent. Why? What was it about this question that led to Buddha's silence? In many traditions, we are told of the soul's journey, reincarnation, heaven, or hell. People desire certainty about the fate that awaits them once they leave their physical bodies. But the Buddha, in his profound wisdom, refused to speak definitively about what happens after death. Instead, he directed us towards a deeper understanding, one that didn't fixate on what might come next, but rather on how we live in the present moment. Buddha's silence on this matter wasn't ignorance or avoidance. He simply saw that the question itself could lead us astray. To fixate on life after death can distract us from the reality of life as it is right now. It can keep us focused on the unknown, while the only thing we truly have control over is the present moment. The Buddha understood that our attachment to the idea of an afterlife often comes from our fear of the unknown. We long for assurance, wanting to know that our existence matters beyond this life. But by obsessing over what happens after death, we miss the point. Life is a fleeting moment, and it's how we live now that truly matters. In the Buddhist teachings, there's a deep focus on impermanence, the truth that everything is in constant flux. Our bodies, our minds, our relationships, everything we know is transient. The moment we grasp onto any part of our existence as permanent, we begin to suffer. Similarly, our attachment to the idea of an afterlife as something permanent can bind us in the same way. So, rather than focus on the abstract question of what happens after death, Buddha guided his followers to understand the nature of life and death itself. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, when asked about his own death, the Buddha's response was clear: "You yourselves must strive. The Buddhas only point the way." He emphasized personal responsibility and the cultivation of wisdom, ethics, and mental discipline as the true path to liberation. In Buddhism, death is seen not as an end, but as a natural part of the cycle of existence, something that occurs in harmony with the law of impermanence. Rather than seeking answers about what lies beyond death, Buddha encouraged us to live fully in the present, cultivating mindfulness and understanding. By doing so, we free ourselves from the fear of death and learn to face it with acceptance and peace. In the end, what we can take from the Buddha's silence is not despair or confusion, but a profound liberation. Death, in Buddhist thought, is not something to be feared or avoided. It is simply another part of life's natural cycle. The question of what happens after death becomes less important when we realize that it is not death itself, but our fear of it and our attachment to it that causes suffering. Now, let's pause and reflect. How often do we worry about the future, whether it be life after death, or the unknowns that await us? What if, instead of obsessing over these questions, we chose to focus on how we live today? Buddha's teachings invite us to shift our perspective, to free ourselves from the cycle of seeking answers to questions that can never fully be answered. By embracing the present moment, we can live more fully, and in turn, face both life and death with equanimity. In the next section, we'll delve into the nature of the self, the illusion of the permanent identity that often creates our greatest suffering. How do we perceive who we are? And what does the Buddha say about the self? Stay with me as we explore this important teaching. Who are you? A simple question, but one that has sparked millennia of philosophical debate. We live our lives identifying with many things: our name, our job, our body, our thoughts. But is this truly who we are? The Buddha, when asked about the self, famously remained silent. This silence wasn't because he didn't understand the question, but because he knew that the very concept of the self was a misunderstanding, a misconception that leads to suffering. In Buddhist philosophy, there is no permanent, unchanging self. The idea of a fixed, independent identity is an illusion, a mirage created by our attachment to the body and the mind. We often think of ourselves as separate, individual entities: this body, these thoughts, this life. But in reality, all things are interconnected, impermanent, and constantly changing. When the Buddha was asked, "What is the self?" he responded not by providing a concrete answer, but by pointing to the five aggregates, or the five skandhas: form, the body; feeling, sensations; perception, awareness of objects; mental formations, thoughts and emotions; and consciousness, awareness itself. These are the components that make up what we call the self. However, none of these components are permanent or independent. They are all in a state of flux, constantly arising and passing away. This teaching is crucial because it challenges the way we typically see ourselves. We tend to cling to our identities, our labels, and our stories as though they are fixed. "I am this person," we say, attaching ourselves to a role, a job, a personality. But the Buddha teaches us that all of these are impermanent, fleeting, and interdependent. When we grasp too tightly to the idea of a permanent self, we suffer. This attachment creates a false sense of I and mine, which is the root cause of much of our dissatisfaction and pain. Take a moment to reflect on your own identity. Who are you, really? Are you the body that you inhabit? The thoughts that come and go? The roles you play in your family, work, or society? Or are you something deeper? Something beyond the impermanent and transient? The Buddha's teaching of anatta, or non-self, invites us to loosen our grip on the notion of a permanent, separate self. It doesn't mean that we cease to exist or that we are nothing. It simply means that we are not fixed, independent entities. We are ever-changing, like a river flowing from one moment to the next. This understanding of non-self isn't just a philosophical concept. It's something that can transform our everyday lives. When we stop identifying with a fixed self, we free ourselves from many of the burdens that come with it: fear of loss, desire for control, and attachment to how we should be. We begin to live more fluidly, in harmony with the present moment, free from the rigidity of self-concept. In Buddhist practice, recognizing the impermanence of the self helps us to cultivate humility, compassion, and a deep sense of interconnectedness with all beings. If there is no permanent I, then we are all interconnected. The boundaries between self and other dissolve. And we begin to see that the suffering of others is also our own suffering. Their happiness is our happiness. So, what does this mean for us in our daily lives? It means letting go of the attachment to who we think we are. It means accepting the fluid nature of our identities and embracing change as a natural part of existence. And most importantly, it means cultivating a sense of freedom from the need to constantly define, protect, or enhance the self. As we move forward, reflect on this question. How much of your stress, anxiety, or unhappiness comes from the way you identify with yourself? How would it feel to let go of that rigid sense of identity and embrace the ever-changing flow of life? The Buddhist teaching of non-self offers us the opportunity to live more freely, to become less attached to the labels and roles that confine us, and to experience life with a greater sense of ease and openness. Next, we'll explore the nature of suffering itself. What is it? Why do we suffer? And how can we transform this suffering into wisdom? Stay with me as we dive deeper into these transformative teachings. What is the true nature of suffering? Why does it seem to permeate every aspect of our lives? No matter how much we strive for happiness or peace, whether it's the pain of losing someone we love, the frustration of unmet desires, or the fear of the unknown, suffering is a universal experience. But the Buddha, with his profound understanding of the human condition, offered us a path to understand and transform suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering, or dukkha, in Pali, is not merely the physical pain we endure, but a much deeper existential unease, the dissatisfaction that pervades our lives even when things appear to be going well. He didn't just say that suffering exists, he delved into why it exists and, more importantly, how we can overcome it. The first of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths is that suffering is an inherent part of life. It's not something we can avoid or escape, no matter how rich, successful, or happy we may appear to be. Suffering will inevitably arise at some point, whether through the loss of something or someone we cherish, or through the simple fact that everything in life is impermanent. This is the first truth of dukkha. Life, by its very nature, is filled with suffering. But the Buddha didn't leave us in despair. He also revealed the cause of suffering. The second noble truth explains that suffering arises from craving or desire, tanha. We crave not only material things but also experiences, recognition, love, and even a sense of security. We desire to hold on to things that are constantly changing, and this very attachment is what causes our suffering. Think about it. How often do we suffer because things don't go as we want? We desire a perfect relationship, a fulfilling job, or a beautiful life, but these desires, when unmet, lead to frustration, disappointment, and pain. In the Buddha's teachings, suffering is also closely linked to ignorance, avidya, the misunderstanding of the true nature of reality. We are ignorant of the impermanence of life, and this ignorance causes us to cling to what is fleeting. The mind believes that if we can just get the right conditions or experiences, we'll be happy forever. But this is an illusion. The world is constantly changing, and so too are we. Nothing stays the same. So, where does this leave us? The Buddha didn't just want to highlight the problem of suffering, he wanted to show us the solution. The third noble truth is that suffering can be overcome. Yes, the path to freedom from suffering is not a far-off dream. It's something that is within our reach. The key is understanding the nature of our cravings and attachments, and learning to let go. And this brings us to the fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering. The Eightfold Path is the Buddha's prescription for ending suffering. It's not a quick fix, but a gradual process of transformation. The path is divided into 8 practices: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Each of these practices helps us to cultivate wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, allowing us to see life more clearly and act with greater compassion and awareness. The Buddha's teachings on suffering remind us that it's not the external circumstances that cause us pain, but our internal responses to those circumstances. Our attachments, desires, and misconceptions shape the way we experience the world. When we let go of these attachments and see life for what it truly is, free from the distortions of craving and ignorance, we begin to find peace. But how do we practice this? How do we start to let go of our attachments and transform our suffering into wisdom? It begins with mindfulness. When we experience suffering, Whether it's physical pain or emotional distress, we can start by simply noticing it. Not judging it, not trying to escape it, but acknowledging it as a natural part of life. By observing suffering without reacting to it, we begin to loosen the grip of desire and attachment. Take a moment to reflect. How much of your suffering is tied to your desires or attachments? What are the things you're holding onto, whether consciously or unconsciously, that are causing you pain? Can you see how your mind is craving certain outcomes, or resisting the reality of change? The practice of mindfulness and meditation is not about escaping life's difficulties but learning to engage with them skillfully. When we accept that suffering is a part of life, and we understand its causes, we can begin to move through it with more wisdom and less fear. We no longer have to be trapped by our desires, our attachments, or our aversions. Instead, we can meet life's challenges with equanimity and compassion, knowing that they are just passing moments in the vast, ever-changing flow of existence. As we move forward, let us hold this question in our hearts. What would it be like if we stopped chasing the illusion of permanent happiness and embraced the natural flow of life? With all its ups and downs? What would it be like if we stopped resisting suffering and allowed it to teach us? The Buddha's teachings offer us a path to freedom, not by avoiding suffering, but by transforming the way we relate to it. Next, we'll explore the question, what is karma? How does it shape our experiences? And how can we work with it to create a life of wisdom and compassion? Stay with me as we continue this journey of self-discovery and awakening. Have you ever wondered why things happen the way they do in your life? Why do we experience certain challenges, while others seem to sail through life without a care in the world? What determines the outcomes of our actions? The Buddha's teachings on karma shed light on these questions, offering a profound understanding of how our actions shape our lives. At its core, karma is the law of cause and effect. It's a natural principle, just like the law of gravity. Every thought, word, and deed we engage in creates an impact, not only in the world around us but also in our own minds and hearts. Karma is not some divine judgment passed upon us, but a reflection of the choices we make and the intentions behind those choices. We often hear the phrase, "What goes around comes around." In a way, this is a simple interpretation of karma. When we act with kindness, generosity, and compassion, we invite positive outcomes into our lives. But when we act out of greed, hatred, or delusion, we set the stage for suffering, either for ourselves or for others. Karma doesn't judge us, it simply reflects the energy we put into the world. In the Buddha's teachings, there is an emphasis not just on the actions we take, but on the intentions behind those actions. This is where the understanding of karma becomes truly transformative. It's not enough to simply act kindly or generously. We must cultivate the right intentions, the right mindset, behind our actions. If we act with genuine love and compassion, then the karmic result will naturally be positive. But if we act out of fear, resentment, or selfishness, we're bound to create negative karma, even if the outward action seems harmless. Now, it's important to note that karma doesn't always produce instant results. It can accumulate over time, ripening later on in ways we might not expect. Sometimes, the consequences of our actions don't manifest immediately, but they are inevitable. This is why the Buddha spoke about karma as both immediate and long-term. We may not see the immediate effects of a harmful action, but the karmic seeds we plant will eventually ripen in our lives. But karma doesn't mean that we are doomed to a life of predetermined suffering. The good news is that karma is not fixed, and it's not a life sentence. We always have the ability to create new karma. Every moment presents an opportunity for us to make choices that align with wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness. If we've created negative karma in the past, we can purify it through right intention, right action, and right effort. We can change the course of our future by transforming the energy we put out into the world today. The Buddha also taught that our karma is not just individual, it's also collective. The actions we take don't only affect us as individuals, but they influence our communities, cultures, and the world. When we act out of selfishness or greed, we contribute to a world of suffering. But when we act with mindfulness, generosity, and care, we contribute to a collective karma of peace and harmony. One powerful aspect of karma that the Buddha emphasized is the idea of volition, or intention. It's not just about what we do, but why we do it. Two people can perform the same action, but if their intentions are different, the karmic results will differ as well. For example, two people may give a gift to a friend. One does so out of genuine love and care, while the other does it to impress others. The action is the same, but the karma created is different. In the first case, the gift is a reflection of generosity, and it creates positive karma. In the second case, the gift may be a reflection of vanity or pride, which creates negative karma. Think for a moment about your own life. What intentions are you bringing to your daily actions? Are you motivated by a desire to help others? Or by a desire to gain something for yourself? Are you mindful of how your actions affect those around you? Karma is also deeply connected to the concept of mindfulness. When we are mindful of our thoughts and actions, we are able to choose our responses more wisely. We can break free from reactive patterns and create new, more positive karmic cycles. Every time we respond with wisdom and compassion, we create new seeds of positive karma, which will eventually blossom into peace, joy, and liberation. But there's another key point that the Buddha made about karma that's worth reflecting on. Karma is not about assigning blame. It's not about finding someone to blame for your suffering or your difficulties. It's about understanding the connections between your actions and their consequences. When we blame others for our suffering, we are ignoring the role our own actions may have played in creating our current situation. True freedom comes when we accept responsibility for our own karma, rather than projecting it onto others. So, how do we begin to work with our karma? The path is not about avoiding it or trying to escape it. It's about becoming aware of it, aware of the intentions behind our actions and the impact those actions have. Through mindfulness and wisdom, we can learn to act in ways that lead to positive outcomes. We can cultivate good karma, not by trying to control everything in our lives, but by living with awareness, compassion, and integrity. As you reflect on the concept of karma, ask yourself, what kind of karma am I creating today? What seeds am I planting in my mind and in my life? Am I acting with wisdom and love, or am I acting out of fear, anger, or ignorance? And most importantly, how can I begin to shift the energy I put into the world toward more positive and compassionate action? The Buddha's teachings on karma remind us that our actions matter. We are not passive victims of fate, but active participants in the unfolding of our lives. Every moment is an opportunity to choose a path of wisdom, compassion, and peace. And by doing so, we begin to create a life of greater harmony, not only for ourselves but for the world around us. Next, we'll explore another profound teaching of the Buddha, the nature of enlightenment. What does it mean to awaken? How do we free ourselves from the cycles of craving and suffering, and live in harmony with the truth of our existence? Join me as we continue this journey towards understanding and liberation. Now, we come to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Buddha's teachings, his silence. It's said that Buddha refused to answer 14 critical questions. Questions that ranged from the eternal nature of the universe to the fate of an enlightened being after death. His silence on these matters has been both a source of confusion and inspiration for countless practitioners and scholars over the centuries. But why did Buddha choose silence? It's important to recognize that Buddha was not simply avoiding these questions. He was not trying to evade the curiosity of the seekers. Rather, his silence served as a profound teaching in itself. The silence wasn't a denial of the truth. It was an invitation, a call to look beyond the words and into the nature of our own minds. To understand this, consider the following. Often, we seek answers to life's deepest questions as if there is a single, concrete answer waiting to be discovered. We demand certainty. We want to understand the universe, the self, and our place in it in terms that our minds can grasp. We want answers that provide us with comfort, answers that soothe our fears, our anxieties, and our longing for control. But Buddha's silence invites us to ask, what if the answers we seek cannot be captured by the limitations of language or conceptual thought? What if the truth is not something we find outside of ourselves, but something we experience directly within our own being? This idea of non-verbal wisdom is present in many spiritual traditions. Not just in Buddhism, it's the idea that some truths cannot be explained in words because they lie beyond the grasp of the intellect. In Buddhism, this is sometimes called direct realization, an immediate, non-conceptual understanding of reality that transcends thought. Think about it for a moment. The more we ask why or how questions, the the more we get trapped in a loop of intellectual pursuit. These questions often lead us in circles, and instead of moving closer to the truth, we end up further away. We become lost in concepts, theories, and ideas that ultimately distract us from the truth we are seeking. Buddha understood that, and so, he chose silence, not because he didn't know the answers, but because the answers to these questions weren't meant to be thought about, they were meant to be experienced. The answers lie not in the concepts themselves, but in the direct experience of reality. Consider the nature of the mind for a moment. We often think of our thoughts as a reflection of the truth. But in reality, our thoughts are more like a stream of passing clouds, fleeting, ever-changing, and not necessarily a clear reflection of the world around us. If we cling too tightly to our thoughts, we risk mistaking them for the ultimate truth. The Buddha's silence was an invitation to step beyond the conceptual world and to look directly into the nature of the mind. In doing so, we can begin to see that our suffering doesn't arise from the external world, but from our relationship with it. It arises from our attachments, our desires, and our beliefs about the world, things that are shaped by the mind, not the reality itself. This is why Buddha's refusal to answer these questions isn't a sign of ignorance, it's a sign of deep wisdom. He understood that in answering these questions directly, he would only reinforce the illusion of separateness and duality, the very things that keep us trapped in cycles of suffering. Instead, he pointed us back to our own experience, encouraging us to look deeply into the nature of our thoughts, our perceptions, and our emotions. In many ways, Buddha's silence is a profound teaching on the nature of impermanence. Everything in life, including our thoughts and beliefs, is temporary. When we ask questions about the eternal, about the nature of existence beyond time and space, we are, in a sense, grasping for something permanent. But nothing in this world is permanent, not even the answers we seek. To grasp the true nature of reality, we must let go of the need for permanence. We must release our attachment to concepts, ideas, and beliefs. This doesn't mean we stop seeking understanding, it means we shift the way we seek. Instead of asking what is the truth, or what is the answer, we begin to ask who am I, and what is my experience right now. Buddha's silence teaches us that the truth we seek is not something we can find through intellectual understanding alone. It is something we experience in the present moment, when we are fully aware of our own mind, our own perceptions, and the ever-changing nature of our thoughts and feelings. Let me give you an example. Imagine you are standing by a river, watching the water flow by. You might be caught up in the thoughts of what the water means, where it's going, or what it represents. But if you simply watch the water, without thinking or labeling, you will begin to see that the water is constantly moving, changing, and flowing, just as your thoughts and your life experience are constantly shifting. Buddha's silence is like that river. It's not a rejection of knowledge, but a reminder to experience the flow of life without the constant need to label, explain, or control it. When we can do that, when we can simply witness life as it is, without getting lost in the stories our minds create, we begin to touch a deeper truth. This silence points us toward freedom, not the freedom to know everything, but the freedom to be with everything as it is. And in that freedom, we find peace, we find liberation, we find the space to let go of our need for answers and to rest in the unspoken wisdom of the present moment. As we continue on this journey of understanding, remember that Buddha's silence is not an end, but a doorway. It's a gateway into a deeper experience of life, one that is not defined by questions, answers, or concepts, but by awareness and presence. So, as you move forward in your own practice, I invite you to reflect on this. What questions do you find yourself clinging to? What truths are you chasing? And how might they be keeping you from truly seeing life as it is? Can you, like Buddha, learn to rest in silence and allow the wisdom of the moment to speak for itself? This is the true freedom that Buddha pointed to. It is not found in answers, but in the space between the questions, in the quiet wisdom that arises when we stop searching for fixed answers and instead open ourselves to the mystery of life itself. And with that, we move on to the next profound question Buddha left unanswered: what happens after death? Stay with me as we explore this deeply significant teaching next. We come now to one of the most profound and universally pressing questions. What happens after we die? This is a question that has puzzled humanity for millennia, transcending cultures, religions, and philosophies. We are all familiar with the deep, existential weight of this inquiry. It is the question that stirs our deepest fears and desires. The question that haunts us in moments of loss and in moments of joy. What happens to us when we breathe our last? The ancient seekers stood before Buddha, asking him this very question. Did an enlightened being continue to exist after death? They wondered, or did they cease to exist entirely? Perhaps both exist and not exist simultaneously? Or neither? The seekers presented these questions, as if they had cornered Buddha, sure that his enlightenment would grant them the answers they so desperately sought. But Buddha's response, as always, was silence. Why? Why did he refuse to speak on this matter that affects every living being? We must pause and consider that Buddha's silence was not a denial of death or an evasion of the question. Instead, it was a deeper teaching about the nature of life, death, and our relationship with the impermanence of all things. In order to understand this, we must first look at how we typically approach the question of death. For most of us, death is a concept that is both terrifying and unknowable. It represents the ultimate end of our bodies, our thoughts, our experiences, and because we cannot fully grasp it, we attempt to define it. We create stories and beliefs, trying to hold on to the notion of life after death, hoping for some kind of permanence beyond this fleeting existence. But Buddha saw something deeper. He saw that clinging to answers about what happens after death is a form of attachment, just like clinging to answers about the self or the universe. It is our attachment to certainty, our desperate need to know what comes after this life, that causes suffering. The desire for a concrete answer to the question of death keeps us trapped in fear, in doubt, and in confusion. Buddha understood that the answer to this question cannot be grasped by the intellectual mind, because it lies beyond the realm of thought. Death, like life, is a mystery, and the more we cling to fixed concepts of what happens after death, the more we resist the natural flow of life and death, which are inextricably linked. Death is not separate from life, it is a continuation of the cycle, a natural part of the ongoing process of impermanence. This is the core of Buddha's teaching on death. Rather than answering directly, he asked us to consider the nature of our attachment to this question. He pointed us toward the truth of impermanence, urging us to see that everything in life, including our bodies, our thoughts, our experiences, are in a constant state of flux. Just as the body is born and grows, it must also age, decay, and eventually cease to exist. This is the natural order of things. There is no permanence in life, and there is no permanence in death. Think for a moment about the grief and anxiety we often feel when someone close to us dies. These emotions are a natural response to loss, but they are also rooted in our attachment to the idea that the person should have continued to live in the way we knew them. We believe that life should persist according to our desires and expectations. But in truth, life and death are beyond our control. They are not something we can dictate, and the more we resist the flow of this cycle, the more we suffer. Buddha's silence on the matter of death encourages us to release our attachment to the notion of permanence and to embrace the reality of impermanence. This does not mean that we should disregard death or live without compassion toward those who are grieving. On the contrary, it means that we should learn to see death not as an end, but as a natural transition, one that is in harmony with the rest of life's cycle. Buddha's silence also reminds us that our attachment to the question of what happens after death often arises from a fear of the unknown. We fear the idea of non-existence, of fading into nothingness. But the more we cling to this fear, the more we deny ourselves the opportunity to live fully in the present. The question of what happens after death will always remain unanswered by the mind. But in the silence, there is an invitation to live with greater awareness and clarity in the here and now. Imagine that you are at the edge of a river, watching the water flow. It flows naturally, effortlessly, without question or hesitation. The river doesn't worry about where it's going, or whether it will ever reach its destination. It simply flows. In the same way, our lives flow, from birth to death, from one moment to the next, without us needing to grasp at what lies beyond. The answer to the question of death is not something we need to know in advance. It is something that will unfold as naturally as the river's journey. Buddha's silence teaches us to stop searching for certainty about death, and instead, to embrace the mystery of it all. In doing so, we free ourselves from the fear and anxiety that often accompany our thoughts of the end of life. we begin to see death as an inseparable part of the flow of life. And we learn to live more fully in the present, without being distracted by the question of what lies beyond. In this silence, there is wisdom. In the space between the questions, there is freedom. And in that freedom, we find peace. As we continue to explore Buddha's teachings, we now move to the next set of questions, the ones that touch us most deeply. The questions about our own suffering. What causes suffering, and how can we escape it? Stay with me as we delve into this profound inquiry next. As we reach the final moment of this journey, I invite you to pause and reflect on what we have explored together. We have journeyed through the vast questions of existence, time, consciousness, and suffering, each of which Buddha approached with a profound silence that spoke louder than any answer could. We began by understanding that the most profound questions, whether about the universe or our place in it, are not meant to be answered in the way we expect. These questions are like the poisoned arrow. The more we struggle to find the right answer, the deeper we sink into our own suffering. The Buddha's silence was not ignorance, it was a teaching. In his silence, Buddha showed us that the pursuit of answers can often be a distraction from the most important work we must do, freeing ourselves from suffering in the present moment. The cosmic questions of whether the universe is eternal, what happens after death, or the nature of the self are all valuable to ponder. But they are not the key to liberation. Instead, Buddha's teachings invite us to turn inward, to focus not on the answers we desperately seek, but on how we live, how we interact with each moment, and how we let go of attachment and desire. The real question is not, what is the universe, or what happens after death? But rather, how do I live today, and how do I embrace this moment fully? Without the need for certainty? In the end, we discover that wisdom is not found in accumulating answers, but in accepting the mystery of life. To live with questions, without the need to resolve them, may seem like a paradox. But it is within this paradox that true freedom lies. As you go forward from this moment, remember that each question you face is an invitation to be more present, an invitation to live more deeply, more authentically. So, when you find yourself lost in the vastness of the universe, in the uncertainty of your own existence, or in the endless questions of life, pause and breathe. Let the silence of Buddha be your guide, not as avoidance, but as a profound invitation to live in the now, to embrace uncertainty, and to find freedom not in the answers, but in the questions themselves. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May we all learn to live with the questions, to dance with uncertainty, and to find peace in the silence.